The weight we carry is not always visible. It is not the burden of a physical form, but the silent accumulation of judgment, of assumptions cast upon us by a world that insists on defining us before we have a chance to define ourselves. This is a universal truth, a shared experience woven into the human condition. But for some, the threads of that judgment are tighter, harsher, and far more binding. For Aliyah Grace, a 32-year-old woman whose life had been a series of quiet battles against expectation, this truth was as tangible as the chipped ceramic of the mug in her hand. The morning light, thin and cold, sliced through the large pane of glass, illuminating the swirling dust motes in the air of the coffee shop. The rhythmic hiss of the espresso machine was a familiar song in her ears, a white noise she often used to drown out the world. Her hands, strong and steady, held a ceramic mug, its warmth a small comfort against the chill of the day. A woman, her body a testament to countless hours in a gym, her leggings, an expensive running jacket a stark contrast to Aliyah's simple uniform, gestured toward her. She was speaking to a friend, her voice a light, airy whisper that carried effortlessly across the counter. "Some people just don't have the body for it," she said, and a thin, knowing smile touched her lips as her eyes flicked to Aliyah's sturdy frame. Aliyah felt the words like a physical blow. It was an arrow crafted from ice and ridicule, and it lodged itself deep within her chest. The sound of ice rattling in the customer's plastic cup echoed in her mind, a cold, hollow sound that seemed to drown out the warmth of the coffee machine. She felt her hands clench on the ceramic, the granite groaning under her grip, and she forced herself to take a slow, steady breath. The memory of 1,000 similar moments washed over her. The sidelong glances, the hushed comments, the unspoken assumption that her body, a vessel of power and strength, was somehow shameful. Her entire life had been a negotiation with the idea that the additional space I took up with my body was a burden to be apologized for. The day wore on, and with it, the humiliation grew heavier. Her shift ended. Aliyah pulled her phone from her pocket, the screen a cold square of glass in her hand. A picture of her, taken without her consent and posted on a local news site, was accompanied by a caption that mocked her for being out of shape. She scrolled through the comments, each one a fresh cut, and the blue light of the screen reflected in her eyes, making them glisten with unshed tears. The words were a relentless assault, a digital chorus of voices telling her she was lazy, unhealthy, and a mockery of an athlete. It was a vicious, systemic judgment, a manifestation of the misogynoir, the unique intersection of racism and misogyny that disproportionately targets Black women and their bodies. They saw her curves not as a sign of natural beauty or strength, but a deviation from a Eurocentric ideal of thinness. They did not see the hours of physical labor she put in at her 2 jobs or the quiet grace with which she carried her existence. The evidence of this prejudice was so profound that even elite athletes like Serena Williams, at the peak of her performance, had been subjected to the same kind of public fat-shaming. The knowledge that her pain was part of a larger unjust system did not lessen the sting, but it did transform it. The moment the last comment loaded on her screen, something inside Aliyah shifted. The pain was still there, but it was no longer a weight she carried. It was a fuel, a silent burning fire. She would not allow their narrative to become her own. She would not let their shallow judgment define her. In the quiet of her tiny apartment, she made a silent promise to herself. She would train in secret, not to prove them wrong, but to prove to herself that the fire in her heart was the only truth that mattered. The run would be her refuge, a place where the only voice that mattered was her own, echoing in her own powerful rhythm. Her shame had become her shield, and her quiet dignity a weapon against an invisible hand. Her journey began then and there, a solitary act of rebellion against a world that had tried to silence her. The world belonged to her after midnight. The city, usually a symphony of traffic and human chatter, settled into a quiet hum, leaving the sidewalks and the empty streets to Aliyah. Her training was a clandestine ritual, an act of faith performed in the darkness. The research she had done in her few stolen moments of free time had confirmed her fears. A lack of representation and a pervasive lack of safe spaces for Black runners meant that her anonymity was her only protection. She pulled her thick, natural hair into a tight bun, tucking it under a cap to ensure her anonymity. The streetlights cast long, distorted shadows that danced ahead of her, a visual manifestation of the fears that chased her. Her breath, a ragged, huffing sound, was the only constant noise, a lonely metronome that measured her effort against the silent indifference of the night. The solitude was both a comfort and a curse. She chose routes that were isolated and poorly lit, not because she preferred them, but because they offered a refuge from the judging eyes. The air carried the scent of wet asphalt and discarded trash, a raw, honest smell that was hers alone. As she ran, her mind drifted back, pulled by the currents of muscle memory and emotional pain. She remembered a basketball coach in high school, a well-intentioned man who had said her body would be perfect for it, a comment that, in retrospect, had only reinforced the stereotype that her body was meant for power sports, not endurance. The memory, like a ghost, made her clench her jaw and push her legs harder, as if the physical pain could somehow exorcise the emotional one. One evening, exhausted and with her feet aching, she passed a dusty thrift store. A small, almost imperceptible voice inside her urged her to stop. She found a pair of used running shoes, a little worn but with plenty of life left in them, in a forgotten box. The narrator described her putting them on for the first time, the faint scent of worn rubber and someone else's past effort clinging to them. The shoes, far from being a perfect, expensive piece of equipment she couldn't afford due to the racial wealth gap, a disparity where the typical Black family holds only a fraction of the wealth of a white family, became a powerful symbol. They were not a monument to her struggle, but a tangible link between her effort and her hope. Her training intensified. She ran longer and faster, her body slowly losing some of its bulk, but not enough to fit into the narrow societal definition of a runner's body. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that the most important thing was not the number on the scale, but the number on the clock, and the number of miles she could cover. Her life was still full of long work days and family obligations, a reality that many in her community faced as sole providers. But her run was her secret, her act of defiance, her small, quiet victory in a world that insisted on a different outcome. She was not just running for herself anymore. She was running for every person who had ever been told they were not enough. And the shoes on her feet, worn and scuffed, were a testament to her unbreakable spirit. The marathon of Aliyah's life was not a singular event. It was a grueling daily race against a system that was designed to make her quit. As her training deepened, the physical exhaustion became a character in its own right, a heavy shadow that clung to her. She worked 2 jobs, a necessity born from the economic realities of her community. The long hours and the need to be the sole provider for her family meant that her training runs often happened after the city had gone to sleep and before it had woken up. The lack of safe and well-lit places to run, a consequence of living in a sports desert, forced her to navigate poorly maintained streets and dodge debris. The physical obstacles were an extension of the systemic ones, a tangible manifestation of a society that didn't create space for her to thrive. The exhaustion was a constant companion, a dull ache that settled in her bones and clouded her mind. The narrative explored her struggle with this constant fatigue. The narrator described her coming home from a long shift, her body screaming for rest, and yet the need to train, to prove her own strength, was a fire that wouldn't be extinguished. One night, in a moment of utter despair, she looked at herself in the bathroom mirror. The dim light revealed an exhausted figure, the sweat on her forehead mixing with tears of frustration. The narrator didn't say that she felt ugly or unfit, but the look of defeat in her own eyes and the sensation that her efforts were in vain were enough. She questioned her purpose. The thought of giving up, of just going back to the life she had before, was a siren song, a tempting escape from the constant struggle. But her breaking point was also her turning point. In her moment of vulnerability, the narrator introduced a subtle, humanizing element. As she stood in the dim light, the silence of the room was broken by a soft hum from her phone. It was a notification from an online group she had found weeks ago, one dedicated to Black women runners. The title, in bold letters, was a simple mantra: "You are not alone." The message was a link to a video from a community like Run Girl, which was creating a space for Black women in the running world and fighting the same battles she was fighting in silence. The video showed women of all shapes and sizes, their faces alight with a shared determination, running and laughing together. It was a spark, a tiny flame of hope in the overwhelming darkness. Her pain and exhaustion were still there, but they were no longer her adversaries. They were a part of her journey, a testament to her resilience. The feeling of being inadequate began to fade, replaced by a quiet, fierce resolve. She was not running away from her past, but toward a future where her body, her effort, and her spirit were her own. She would not quit. The air in Boston was crisp with the promise of autumn, and the starting line of the marathon was a churning sea of humanity. Aliyah stood in the middle of the crowd, a study in quiet defiance. She wore simple training clothes, a stark contrast to the high-end branded gear of the runners around her. The narrator, in an omniscient voice, captured the subtle, dismissive glances she received, the visual assumptions that her body was an anomaly in the world of endurance sports. For Aliyah, the race was not just a physical challenge, it was a final, cathartic battle against the shame she had carried for so long. She thought of pioneers like Marilyn Bevans, the first Black American woman to win a marathon, whose achievements had gone largely unrecognized for years, a testament to the lack of representation she herself felt. The race began, a roar of sound and a rush of movement that swallowed her whole. The physical struggle was immediate and intense, the salty taste of sweat on her lips mixed with the burning in her lungs, and the pounding of her knees became a constant rhythmic agony. Every step was a choice, an act of will that opposed the pain and the doubt that whispered in her mind. The narrator took us into her thoughts, where the physical agony of the race was intertwined with the memories of the criticism that had tormented her. Her mind, racing, replayed the sound of the customer's whisper, the cold rattling of the ice, and the cruel words on the screen. In a moment of pure desperation, when her body threatened to give out, she saw them. A small Black girl, maybe 10 years old, was in the crowd of spectators, her eyes wide and full of wonder. The girl, who perhaps echoed the experience of Shawana White, who was inspired by seeing another Black runner, saw not a runner with an inadequate body, but a figure of pure, unadulterated strength. "Go! Go!" the girl screamed, her small voice a beacon of hope in the sea of noise. The narrative shifted, describing the scene from the child's perspective, who saw her hero not as an anomaly, but as a reflection of herself. This moment of connection shattered Aliyah's pain. She was no longer running for herself, but for that little girl, and for all the others who believed their bodies were not made for sports. The final stretch to the finish line was a crescendo of sound and vision. The roar of the crowd grew louder, the world blurred by exhaustion, but she kept moving, her legs pumping, a testament to the quiet dignity of her struggle. Aliyah crossed the finish line, not in first place, but victorious. The narrator described the physical collapse of her muscles, the taste of victory in her mouth, and the feeling of pure, unadulterated relief. Her victory was not in a medal or a position, but in the completion of a journey that had been her own. The story did not end at the finish line. In the weeks that followed, a photograph of Aliyah, exhausted but triumphant, went viral. The same media outlets that once perpetuated the narrow standard of what a runner should look like now celebrated her as a symbol of resilience and inspiration. The narrative focused on the comments from people who saw her picture and felt a profound sense of recognition. A Black girl wrote that she finally felt seen. A mother said she showed the photo to her daughter, telling her that her body was a fortress of strength. Aliyah's victory was no longer just her own. It was part of a larger, silent legacy, echoing the achievements of pioneers like Marilyn Bevans and Samia Akbar, whose stories had often been overlooked. The narrative connected her story to the broader movement of groups like Black Girls Run and Run Girl, which fight for the visibility and representation of Black women in the running community. Her story, it showed, was not an isolated incident, but a reflection of a rising community determined to reclaim its space. The narrator explained that her true prize was not the medal, but the reconquest of her own agency and the discovery of a community she never knew existed. The pain was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence. The story ended with Aliyah training again, but this time not in secret. Maybe she was in a local park with a new friend or a young girl who saw her at the marathon. The narrator focused on her confident form, the cap she once used to hide herself, now just an accessory of her choice. She no longer needed to hide. The conclusion invited the audience to reflect on their own struggles and victories, recognizing that the marathon of life, for each of us, is a silent act of overcoming and a testament to human strength.